Hey there! Today I'm sharing a card using Pink and Main's new stamp set, You Can Fly, and the coordinating die. I originally planned on making this a spinner card, but since the butterfly in the set is kind of large, it didn't turn out right, but I'm going to share the card anyway. So I'm using a bunch of Pink and Main surface inks, which are permanent inks that you can use with watercolors and alcohol markers. But in this case, I stamped the inks on acetate and actually used them as watercolors. And I wasn't really sure if you could do this, but I did it anyway. I'm painting it onto a piece of Canson XL watercolor paper, and I'm kind of just putting colors wherever I felt like it. I wanted to segregate the pink from the yellow and the blues, but everything worked well together. Nothing got too muddy, and all the colors that I'm using will be listed down below. So once I get my first layer down, I'll use a heat gun to speed up the process of drying. And I just want to do this because the colors came out kind of light since I mixed it down with water. So they're a little bit lighter than I wanted. So I add a second layer of color. And this is just to darken up some of the colors I already had put down. You'll see that I really like how the pink pops on the watercolor paper, and I'm just adding to the vibrancy of it. And I think it turned out pretty cool. It looks like a big old mess, and I wasn't really sure about it, but it ended up looking pretty cool in the end. So once again, I'm using my heat gun to dry this off, and I just am very impatient, so I didn't want to wait. And the heat gun really helps speed along the process for watercolors, and it also helps build those layers. For watercolors, I usually do a couple layers of colors, but in this case, I wanted to keep it pretty light, so I only did 2 layers of the watercoloring with these two inks. So I wanted to make sure that it's super dry, and then I'll pull out my Finetech pearlescent watercolors and use the gold color for some gold splatter. I really wanted some shimmer to the butterflies that I'll be creating using this paper, and I think that the gold specks would add a bit of detail to the butterfly itself. And then I wanted to take it a step further, and so I'm using Hero Art's white iridescent shimmer spray on the entire piece of watercolor paper. And this definitely gives it that really, really pretty shimmer, but it also wets the entire paper. So I had to use my heat gun and make sure that everything was completely dry since I'm going to be heat embossing on this. I really like how the shimmer mist adds a great glittery effect to it where it's not super glittery and it just makes it look super pretty. You can see it when it moves and when it hits the light, and it's just gorgeous. And I know that this detail might be a little lost because we are heat embossing a super detailed stamp, but I didn't care. I really liked how it looked. So taking the stamp set, I'm going to place this piece of watercolor into my Misty, and I'm going to just stamp directly onto the watercolor. It's kind of warped because of the heat, so I'm just taping it down with some washi. I make sure to add an anti-static powder tool on top of the paper to make sure that the embossing powder won't be sticking to random areas. And I end up trimming this in half just to make it easier on myself. So I'll go ahead and stamp out this butterfly, and I take a bit of time adding ink and really pushing down on it just because there's so many details on it. This stamp is absolutely gorgeous. And once I have finished the stamping, I'll add the embossing powder and make sure that like all the little nooks and crannies are covered. And I'll take my heat gun to this once again, carefully, and melt that powder. I'll repeat for the second piece. I was intending to make a spinner card, so I wanted to create a butterfly on both sides, so there was no blank side to the butterfly. You'll see later on, it doesn't really work out, but it's kind of cool for a floating butterfly card. It wasn't what I originally intended, but sometimes that's just what happens with cards, and I already had filmed this, so I wanted to share it. So I'm using that coordinating die to cut out the two butterflies, and I really like how this die cuts out the antennas. It's such a super fine detail, but it's so important for a butterfly. So I really appreciate that they included this little detail for the butterfly. As you can see, the butterfly is symmetrical, so I'm able to put them together and they fit perfectly on top of each other. To put these together, I'm using Tombow Mono Multi Glue and a piece of clear string. You can't really see the clear string, but the clear string will go in the middle. And I had intended for the spinner card, of course, but it just doesn't work out. So it just kind of looks like a floating butterfly on the card. And I stick an acrylic block on top just to make sure all the pieces are held down while it's drying. So I decided that I wanted a pop of color, but just not a solid piece of paper. So I pulled out the Pink and Main Shades of Spring paper pad and decided on this pink patterned paper. I think that it really ties together with the butterflies since there was a lot of pink on the butterfly that I used. And I'm using the card panel and the piece of pattern paper and I'm die cutting it all at one time just so I can make sure that everything lines up correctly. The square is big enough for the butterfly to fit, and originally it should have been big enough for the butterfly to spin, but since I think it's because I used watercolor paper, and the image is kind of larger, it had issues spinning. I usually don't have issues with spinner cards, but I don't know what happened. So I'm just placing score tape on the front panel of the card. I'm going to work on putting the butterfly with the clear string in the taped pieces so everything stays put before I put down that pattern paper. So I wrap around the clear string on the top portion, and for the bottom portion, I have adhered it by the score tape. So that really holds it down. And it should spin, theoretically, but it just didn't work. So I go ahead and add the pattern paper and make sure that everything lines up. So I do this by adding it to the card panel piece by piece just to make sure everything lines up before I remove all the score tape. So once the score tape is done, uh, I trim off any pattern paper that's hanging over the card base. There's not that much. I just did it just in case because sometimes when I measure things and I die cut and everything has to line up perfectly, it just doesn't work out. So I kind of made sure that this would work out by cutting out a piece that was a little too big for this. So I think here I kind of realized that it didn't really spin that well. But you know what? I already made the card, and so I'm going to complete it. I'm going to stamp out a sentiment from the stamp set using one of the surface inks. I believe that this color is Rose Garden. It matches the pattern paper. It's a little bit darker. It's a shade of pink though. So I think that everything matched. I considered using black, but I thought it would be too harsh since everything was just light and flirty and pretty on this card. So once I stamp that sentiment out, I'm cutting this on a strip and using my T-ruler to help line up that sentiment. I just add score tape on the back of that just to make this quick and easy. And I'll go ahead and adhere it to the front bottom portion of the card. And I really liked how this card turned out, even though it didn't end up being a spinner card. Since I used clear string, it looks like the butterfly is just floating. I tried to make it spin. It kind of moved, kind of didn't. But that's okay. It still turned out really pretty. I think it's pretty cool, and you have space to write on the bottom of the card, and it's a good effect to have. Sometimes your cards don't turn out right, and that's okay. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this card with all its problems, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.